I've teamed up with Dehancer Film Emulation to test out their plugin with CG renders, and they're offering viewers of this channel 10% off their products at checkout when you use the code Chomp Studio. I'll have a link for that in the description below. Alright, so today we're talking about film effects, and one of the things we always talk about on this channel is film effects when we watch our cinematics or CG renders. And I've been lucky enough to test out the latest version of Dehancer, and it's film emulation plugin for After Effects. And getting that film look in our CG renders is always something we're trying to achieve. So we're going to take a look at that plugin today, and we're going to run through some of the post-processing tricks that I've been using that's been helping out making my CG renders look a little bit more film-like. All right, so here we are in Blender. This is the scene we're going to be using today. And just right off the gate, you can tell it's very crisp and nice looking 3D, not super realistic. Let's go back in the camera view. We have a little bit of depth of field, and let me turn on our preview here. We can get a little bit of a look at our fog and everything as well. This is what the scene is looking like right now. We are using some cycles, and we have our HDRI in the background. And overall, this is not a bad starting spot, but it does look a little CG. It's a little too sharp. There's some things we can do in post. So let's go ahead and render this out. And let's bring the results into After Effects and start working our way through the Dehancer plugin. All right, this is where the fun begins. So what we have here, I did render this out as an EXR, but we don't really have any layers to work with or anything. So let's run through the post process of how I like to make the CG that we've been doing look a little bit more filmic. So first thing I like to do is this base render is always going to be pretty sharp, and you can add a Gaussian blur to kind of, get a little bit of that sharpness edge off of there. But another trick too I like to do sometimes, if I turn this all the way up, is I have a layer on top that has a fast blur on it. But if we kind of just tone this down and mix it in a little bit, we kind of soften everything up and get a little bit of that sharp edginess off of it. A couple of things I add before we start the color grading process is I just added a couple little light beams, just to mask matching the lighting, just to kind of look like it's cutting through that fog just a little bit. And then right here, I added another white solid to kind of emphasize the headlights a little bit on the side here. And this will be our Dehancer layer. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to delete that so we start off from scratch. And then eventually at the top here, I did have a little bit of chromatic aberration in Blender, but I'm using some quick chromatic aberration here with a little bit of a mask to kind of get that right on the edges. And this might be a little bit, we do have a little bit of our chromatic aberration already in there from Blender, but this is just giving it, a little bit more of a little bit of an oomph to it. So, all right, so with all that being said, let's make this our color correction layer. And we're gonna go ahead and add Dehancer Pro. It starts right off with one of the film stocks already added to it to kind of see your effects and what's happening. And a quick note, there are a lot of settings here. And if you're more interested in just film grain or the halation, or even the sweet monitor effect that we'll go to later, on Dehancer's website, if you get the Pro version, it'll have all of this in there. But if you want only a specific feature, they do have those, and it will be a little bit cheaper if you wanted to focus on either just bloom, halation, or the film grain features, which are really nice and been updated, and we'll go through those right now. Okay, so the first thing we'll go through here is I have the input set to Rec 709 because that's what we rendered out. If you do something else, you can set it that as well to start your base grade. If you want to control the temperature and all that stuff, you can do that from the beginning, but I'm just going to kind of leave this as default for now because I want to get into the good stuff. All right, cool. So what it's starting off on is one of the really popular film stocks, Codec Vision. But if you're like me, I like to kind of go through all of these and see what we got. One of the things that I like to do is, so you don't have to basically click through all of these, is I like to be able just to quickly do this. And what I like to do on top of this effect is add a slider control. And I'll take the profile and I will parent it to this slider control. And what that'll do is I can quickly just push up or down arrows to start, cranking through these and seeing what stands out to us and what we kind of like. So let's just kind of quickly go through these. So what's nice is we get to see we're in the Fuji section. I'm gonna just kind of scroll really quick up to Kodak because I like a lot of these. I'm looking at kind of the nice orange sunset, so maybe we start something that's sort of emphasizing that and maybe not changing the color too much, like something like this or the monochrome. Ooh, that's nice. Emphasizing our gold sun. So that was 34. That's Kodak. Okay. I just wanted to see Porta. I always seem to really like. All right, so let's go back to that one. All right, cool. So let's start with this. And we can basically start pushing and pulling these settings around to get something that we like. Another thing that I like to have up while we're doing this is having my scopes up so we can kind of see our black and white levels. And if you're in a pro field, or if you need some sort of specific IRE levels you're having to meet for broadcast, this is really helpful. But they also have some awesome monitor apps here that if you're specific and need that, I'll show you those settings as well, which really helps with that color grading. All right, so like I mentioned, there are a lot of settings here, and I kind of like to just work my way down. But one thing I do want to start with really quick is this film grain is awesome, and we're definitely going to add it later. But for now, I'm just going to turn that off to kind of see what everything looks like in a clean slate. Let's just start with Film Developer, and let's give ourselves a little bit more contrast. Oh, but you see nothing's happening, right? So a lot of these default, not having them enabled. So let's enable the effect. All right, we're already getting nice contrast. I'm kind of looking at my levels over here. I don't want to crush the blacks too much right now. And the whites are hitting a little hot, but we will be able to fix that and adjust that as well. Color boost is kind of giving us more saturation. You can go nuclear like that if we want, but I might just give it a little bit of a subtle color burst as well. And again, I encourage a lot of people to test all these settings. There's just so much control in one plugin. It's really nice. And I even have like a bunch of presets and stuff saved after I've made some corrections that I like. And then that way I can quickly access them all later. All right, so I'm just adjusting the gamma there a little bit. Again, we could spend so much time playing with all these. Let's keep moving down. All right, film compression. The cool thing about this is look at the roll off of the highlights after we do this. And what it's doing is it's adjusting our white roll off levels. So look at the headlights and the sun, for example. Look at all that detail we're getting back in that. And it's not letting these highlights peak too high up. When color grade or adjust contrast, things can get overly saturated. So for example, if I add a levels here and we didn't have this on, if I want to like try to get some contrast, things can start to get, things can start to get a little too saturated or crushed. And then you kind of gotta tweak the mid levels and highlights. I gotta bring my white levels down because they're getting a little bit too hot. The nice thing with this plugin is you have all that control here and you just start massaging and tweaking it. So you're kind of getting the image that you want in the sections that you want without losing any other areas. So I might just bring that white down a little bit and we'll just sort of leave that for now and keep moving forward. So the expanding of this is going to elevate our white levels and black levels again. We might come back to this as well. If we start crushing our blacks too much, we might need to come and adjust this. So for now, I'm just going to reset that. Print is pretty cool because we get another set of exposure tools that instead of kind of just adjusting the highlights, it's sliding everything up and down. And again, we can sort of boost this contrast a little bit. This is kind of a little bit of like our secondary sort of color correction there. And really it's just a matter of pushing and pulling this to kind of get a look that we like. Color head's also probably one of my other favorite tools. It's very similar, if you're used to color wheels and stuff. And a lot of times we talk about the orange and teal look. So orange and teal look is in the shadows and the highlights, and a really popular look is teal in the shadows and orange in the highlights. And so right here, just in the shadows alone, let me enable this. Now, if we look down in these dark areas and the shadows, we can control the temperature and the tone of what we want for that. So here, we're going really, really orange right here. But if we kind of want that blue and teal look, I'm going to move it back into the cool area just a little bit. Obviously too much. So let's just go cool a little bit in the shadows. And let's boost up the orange in the highlights. Now, this might be a lot. Maybe we just go a little bit. We don't go too crazy. And we don't want to cool down on this one. So we're just going to go a little bit in that. And again, we have more tools for preserving exposure. How much is this affecting the whole image? All it goes up. If there's no impact, nothing's happening. And that's a common setting throughout here. All right, one of my favorite new features, and if you've used any old Dehancer stuff, this has changed a little bit. Let me show you how great this is. So first off, let me enable it. And we get to choose not only what kind of grain we want, but at what ISO level it is, which is so awesome. So if we go with an ISO 500, it's probably a little bit more noisy. If anyone's familiar with camera settings, that's what we're starting to get into now, is the kind of grain that we get from our cameras, our lenses, as well as halation, bloom. These are all film emulation effects, as well as monitoring here at the bottom. So let me go ahead and just zoom up in here really quick. So if we're at ISO 500, ISO is getting a higher ISO, so we're gonna have a more noisy image. If we go with 50, it's gonna be a little bit more subtle. And the cool thing is we have all these presets already built in for 16 millimeters, so we kind of get our chunkier noise, which is awesome, and our 65 millimeter, which is going to be a lot finer. But one of my favorite features is going into the custom settings. And if we want to look at examples of what film grain actually does, it's actually more in the highlights and the shadows. This might be really hard to see over the compression, but in Dune, for example, a lot of these scenes, you'll see the grain in really the highlights and not as much in the dark tones. And the compression might be a little hard to see in this as well, but I'm seeing a little bit more grain on these edges versus the dark in the center. So instead of just slapping a film grain plate over this and setting it to screen, we actually have control over the highlights, midtones, and dark areas, the shadows, on where we want our grain to be. So I'm gonna crank the size of this all the way up. I'm gonna crank the amount all the way up, just so we can kind of see what we're working with here. So if we follow the same principles of what we were looking at, we don't want much grain in the shadows. So maybe like 1 for something like this. Let's see, same with kind of like our mid-tone areas. We want to bring that down a lot too. Let's take a look at our dark areas now that we tone those down a little bit versus our highlights. And of course, we're going to massage this, but this is just a great example to show the control that we have, because now we can sort of massage in these highlights to not be as so much. But also I want the size to be smaller, a little bit subtle, and we don't need that much. So now that we brought it down a little bit, I can bring this back into the highlights. I can toggle this on and off. And we just see what a difference it is just to be able to have that level of control now, instead of just slapping a plate over it, like I mentioned, and setting it to screen and just kind of tweaking it there. This is giving us exact control over what areas we want. And honestly, maybe I'll just add a little bit more because I think it looks pretty cool. And again, you can play with film resolution, like how chunky you want your grain to be, how fine you want it to be, and even what chroma levels should be affected by this. Again, lots of settings. And if you want just the film grain alone, you can get just the film grain effect off of their website as well. Another one of my favorite effects is the halation, and we want to use this subtly as well, kind of like film grain. So let's pull up our examples again. Let's pull up sweet, sweet baby Tom Cruise in First Top Gun. But halation is this nice glow effect that we're getting from highlight areas and how it bleeds over the bike a little bit. This is a great example of an effect that happens in camera, and once it goes to film, it's giving it that effect to it. So we have control over halation in ours as well. Now, I don't have many spots of light, but let's go ahead and turn it on. And we do have a mask mode, but this image might not have enough to look at it. But again, we can select our presets. Again, we can set this to custom. And since we can do whatever we want, I'm gonna try to turn up all these to see if we can see it. Okay, so we're getting some really down here by the rocks. And what's cool about the mask mode is I can isolate this to kind of dial in how much I want. Source limiter is limiting how much in the scene gets affected. And here are the big settings is the local and global diffusion. So look how much we're sort of getting in the scene now. And we can do the source limiter to maybe tweak and bring some of this back. And these settings are super high, but we're doing it just, to kind of get an idea of what we're looking at. We can turn off the mask mode, and you can see we're getting that similar halation effect happening over this. Now, just really quick, let's just Let me turn the mask mode back on and let's just dial this way back. The extra little glow that's going on the rocks and blending and merging this image all together is just such a great effect. All right, bloom. All right, so again, we're getting some bloom on the rock. If you use bloom in Blender and stuff, you're very familiar with this already, but we're just giving a nice soft glow to everything. And if we want, for the sake of this tutorial, let's amplify everything and get a little crazy with it. And maybe we diffuse it out. And there we go. We're getting a nice light bleed from the scene over the rocks. Again, just blending it, smoothing everything out, adding a little bit to that realism. All right, so these next effects, film damage and stuff, you guys are probably familiar with film damage. This image doesn't really call for it, but let me go through some of the settings just so you can look at it. Again, we'll set this to custom and we can start to tweak. You can see all the little specks and things happening. We can add hairs, all the film damage and effects that we're used to seeing. And if you want to give your stuff that look, you can do that. We can tweak it up. This image I'm trying to keep clean, so we probably won't enable that for now. All right, so film breath and gate weave, you're not really going to see much in the example of a still image, but I'll quickly just describe these. And I would encourage you to read up more on this. But basically, film breath is the kind of natural occurrences of shifting colors or contrast, little subtle changes in exposure while the film is running through the camera while it's rolling. And so you'll see a little bit of that, and a subtle effect of that for your animations can give it more of a film feel because we're sort of used to seeing that with our eyes. You might see little back and forth movements as the film is sort of going and rolling through the projector and shaking a little bit back and forth. And again, that can also feel very natural and is an effect. If you want it, you can add in this plugin as well. Overscan is cool if you want to add some of those, film rolling effects to the side. We can talk about that more later. Probably don't need it for this example. In continuing with our color grading process, add a little bit of vignette and I'll show you what I like to do for this. So I like to take the feather down to 0 and I'll bring the exposure down. And this image is not 16:9, it is widescreen at 235. So let's go ahead and adjust the aspect ratio. All right, cool. Then we'll just feather this out. And let's just bring it down a little bit. Nice and subtle. And if I wanted to, I could probably actually bring it to the left just a little bit so we don't lose too much of our sun. One of my favorite features, and if any of you come from a videography background, you're going to love this, but it is our monitoring tools. And the first one that comes up is our false color settings. For anyone not familiar with false colors, what we have here is a tonal range representing the light values or the luminance values of how dark or bright something is. Gray represents an even exposure at 50%. Once you start seeing things that are red, that information is usually clipping. Same with down here, purple. And what clipping means is if you give this to someone and your values are clipped, they will not be able to recover that information if they need to color grade or do anything with that on their end, mainly with film or video. So just using this, we get a good example of areas that are getting a little too under or overexposed. Some things you might want to leave exposed, like if your 3D scene has a really bright open window and you're shooting inside the interior, that would actually be exposed for the inside, so you'd want to leave that probably blown out, so you won't have to worry too much. But in stuff like this, we can bring back these bright and dark levels. So let's adjust those colors so we're not losing too much information in our highlights up here, marked by red. This light's not too bad. It is a headlight, it'll be bright. I don't like the loss of detail in the rocks here. So the first thing I might try is going up to expand. Here we can control our black and white points. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit just to see what the purple looks like. Just until we're kind of getting rid of the purple. So out of curiosity, let's put in 0. And I'm gonna just toggle back and forth and see what we're doing. And what's happening is it is making our image a little bit brighter, but look at all the detail that we're getting back in the rocks, seeing that that was underexposed. Cool, so let me turn the false colors back on. We're getting a little hot up here, so I might actually just clip those whites just a little bit. And let's kind of see what we got now. So let's bring this back to -5.5. And there we go. So another feature, if you feel weird about the false colors, another quick way to look at that is just clipping indication, which is going to let you know straight away your highlights and your darks. So if I start to make this too dark, that's represented by blue. So that is way underexposed. We're not going to get that information back. So we'll go back to something like -5. Same with the highlights. If we bring this up too much, it's going to let us know what's overexposed. This is just a good double check to have as well. And honestly, you could probably leave this on the whole time you're color grading. One thing that I am noticing now though, is it's feeling a little underexposed. We might want to bring these values up a little bit, but not get too crazy because we don't want to go too high up. And so now we can use the tonal impact, which is everything that was affected, to see how we started and where we ended up. It's interesting to know that we were clipping a little bit in the sun and the headlight before we even started. So this would be the before, and this is the after. You know, it's not bad, but one last thing I'd do, I'll probably just go ahead and leave the monitor on. And let's get a little bit of that contrast back. I'm looking over at my scopes again. I just want to bring, we're starting to get a little bit in the black, but then let's go ahead and, so now that we kind of see the before and after, we could maybe bring these midtones up just a little bit more. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. I like to start with the print, and I can kind of just bring my exposure up a little bit. And let's get some of our contrast back without trying to lose too much of the black information. And there we go. Let's look at the before and after and see if we like where we ended up. So we went from our flat image to this nice color boost and contrast, and just these subtle film effects is really adding a lot of realism to our 3D render. So there we go, guys. There's a quick breakdown of my color grading process that I've been doing lately for my CG renders using Dehancer Pro, and I'll leave the details to Dehancer in the description. And we definitely have more content coming out using this plugin because we're starting to implement it into our workflow with a lot of things. So feel free to reach out. I'll answer any questions as they come up, and I will talk to you guys in the next video. Have a great one.